Hello and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Okay, new stories for this week. There are 3 stories that I wanted to talk about. As always, I've tried to avoid the trade war but have failed miserably because that's what's in the news. But I'm hoping that I can use this first story to kind of talk about other things that are not just solely focused on tariffs. So, the first story is that China has accused the US of seriously violating the trade truce. This is a piece in The Guardian. Beijing says it will safeguard its interests after Donald Trump claimed it had totally violated the agreement. So this is sort of following on from the meeting in, was it Switzerland? Was it Geneva? I can't remember where it was. They met up and they agreed to call a truce, a 90-day truce, on the tariffs for the meantime. But it seems like things are already going wrong. How surprised are we? And basically this is the two sides sort of hurtling accusations back and forth. So China has accused the US of seriously violating the fragile US-China détente that has been in place for less than a month since the two countries agreed to pause a trade war that risked upending the global economy. They agreed to pause it for 90 days on the 12th of May. But since then, trade negotiations have faltered, with the US complaining that China has not delivered on promises to roll back restrictions on the export of key critical minerals to the US. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Sunday, "What China is doing is they're holding back products that are essential for the industrial supply chains of India, of Europe, and that's not what a reliable partner does." During the period of aggressive retaliatory trade measures between the US and China in April, China had restricted the export of certain rare earth minerals and magnets, which are critical for US manufacturing. The restrictions were expected to be relaxed after 12th of May, but the process appears to have been patchy at best. Now US companies, particularly car manufacturers, are reportedly running out of magnets, which is a weird sentence to say. China hit back on Monday, accusing the US of violating and undermining the agreement reached in Geneva and the consensus between Trump and Xi Jinping, China's presidents, in their 17th of January phone call. The US has successively introduced a number of discriminatory restrictive measures against China, including issuing export control guidelines for AI chips, stopping the sale of chip design software to China, and announcing the revocation of Chinese student visas. The US has indicated that another Xi-Trump call is expected soon. So that's all to be expected, to be honest. I don't think anybody really expected things to be peaceful or to go quickly or smoothly. I think manufacturers and exporters were happy and excited, as were sellers in the US, that the tariffs had been called off for now. But obviously it's escalated, or it's sort of spilled over into other areas that it wasn't even really touching before. And I wanted to talk about one of those areas, which is the decision by the US to revoke student visas. This has been quite a trending topic recently. There was the Chinese student at Harvard who gave the sort of final speech, and that's drawn a lot of interest, criticism, support from different factions. But essentially what the US administration wants to do, Marco Rubio, is to prevent Chinese students from coming to the US, studying in US universities in critical fields, in, surging fields like technology, computing and things like that, and then taking that information back to China, and also prevent spying as well. This has been a big thing for quite some time, but again seems to have been highlighted and escalated specifically by the trade war, by the Trump administration the second time round. So another Guardian piece from last week reads that China has lodged a protest over the US declaration that it will aggressively revoke the visas of Chinese students studying at universities. A spokesperson for the Chinese government, Mao Ning, accused the Trump admin of using national security and ideology as a pretext for the unreasonable decision, which seriously damaged the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese students and disrupted the normal cultural exchanges between the two countries. She added, "This political and discriminatory practice of the US has exposed the lies of the so-called freedom and openness that the US has always advertised, and further damaged the US's own international image, national image, and national credibility." I just want to pause on that statement really quickly, because I think that the spokesperson has sort of hit on something that a lot of people have been feeling in different sectors recently. We've seen cases where foreign travellers, expats, and just people who are on holiday have been detained at the US border under very harsh conditions. We've seen cases where US residents, I don't think citizens, but US residents have been exported to prisons in South America for undetermined crimes for indeterminate amounts of time. So I think there is this growing sense of discomfort around how the US deals with foreigners, and I think this revocation of Chinese student visas is another part of that. There was also a travel ban introduced, I believe, for 12 different countries, with, you know, barring the exception of like the Olympics and things like that. So it's clearly part of a larger trend within the US of sort of closing the doors to foreigners, and obviously China being sort of enemy number one is going to be first to go. But I wanted to talk a bit more about the impact of specifically banning Chinese students from studying at Chinese universities. Young Chinese people have long been crucial to US universities, which rely on international students paying full tuition. China sent 277,398 students in the 23-24 academic year, although India has surpassed it for the first time in years. In this previous term, Trump also took aim at Chinese students but focused attention on those in sensitive fields or with explicit links with the military. A diplomatic cable signed by Rubio on Tuesday ordered US embassies and consulates not to allow any additional student or exchange visa appointment capacity until further guidance is issued on increasing screening of applicants' social media accounts. The measures also threaten to put pressure on students from countries friendly to the US. Trump is furious at Harvard for rejecting his administration's push for oversight on admissions and hiring, amid his claims the school is a hotbed of anti-Semitism and woke liberal ideology. I don't really understand the link between Chinese students and woke liberal ideology. I think it'd be quite the opposite, but I think it's just part of like a larger sort of inflationary war on universities and education, particularly higher education in the US. A judge paused the order to bar foreign students pending a hearing scheduled for Thursday, the same day as the university's graduation ceremony. The same graduation ceremony where the young Chinese woman gave her speech. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Chinese student enrollment in the US and how much money that actually brings in. So for those who are just listening, I have a graph up from the BBC. This is from 2019, and it shows that in the 2017-2018 academic year, there were around 360,000 Chinese students enrolled in US universities. So that is not an insignificant number. It brings in billions. The amount Chinese students and their families contribute to the US continues to rise. This is estimated to have been $13 billion US dollars in 2017 to 2018, a figure that includes tuition fees and living expenses. So there's kind of like a dual thing going on here, right? So the attractiveness of US universities is a huge sign of the US's soft power, because there are many world-class universities in China, but still studying abroad is still a sign of, you know, your education for some reason is unmatched elsewhere in the world, even though China is trying to match the US on pretty much every grounds. And people always think that Chinese students are smarter, but for some reason going to the US still has that prestige attached to it. Xi Jinping's daughter studied in the US. She still lives in the US as well. And then on the other hand, Chinese students contributing to the US economy and to higher education is a huge boost. And without that funding, and considering that the US, the current administration, wants to defund many universities because of this woke liberal ideology, there is a huge risk of some of these institutions, particularly the private institutions, going under, right? Or at least like being in really precarious situations, having to make huge cutbacks, and then therefore losing that global prestige because they don't have the funding. They're not getting the, you know, the top professors, they don't have the top courses anymore, they're no longer attracting the top students. So this is just going to have a knock-on effect if it does indeed take place, if it does continue for many years. In general, the enrollment of Chinese students in US universities has fallen, and in going the other way, US students to China, it's never been particularly high. So if the tensions continue, it's likely to just keep falling off a cliff. And I think that it's going to be a compounding effect. And what we should be looking at in the future, over the maybe the next decade or so, is the state of the US university, which is interesting because there are a lot of neoliberal thinkers or right-wing speakers in the US, in North America, who have already been critiquing the US education system, the US university system, saying that it's no longer performing at its best. And this measure is not going to improve that at all. This is just going to make things way, way worse in terms of performance, at least. So even if you don't like the ideology or the type of thinking that comes out of these universities, in terms of the education level and what it offers to the rest of the world, and the branding and the soft power that it provides for the US, is going to tank, basically. So that's going to be one major knock-on effect of the tariff war that I don't think that anybody really saw coming, but we'll see how it plays out over the next few years. Right, another story is about the UK, and I was particularly interested in this story because I'm a British person myself. So it's kind of like an in-depth dive by the BBC titled "Why Labour is Strengthening Ties with China After Years of Roller Coaster Relations." There's been a lot of scaremongering, particularly during the Conservative administration. For the people who don't know about British politics, we had a Conservative government for 15 years. And during that period, there was a lot of anti-China rhetoric. There was some business dealings with China, but generally speaking, the feeling was suspicion towards the CCP, even from the opposition government, which was Labour, because obviously China is an authoritarian regime, and Labour were ostensibly concerned with their human rights record and things like that. So, and also during this time, we had a much closer relationship with the US, and obviously China and the US are not too friendly. So in the minds of British politicians in the past, since the Second World War, essentially, there has been a special relationship between the UK and the US. And, you know, they're like brothers at arms, friends across the pond, however you want to put it. Successive prime ministers, think people like Tony Blair and George W. Bush in particular had a very close relationship, and that sort of facilitated the UK support and entry into the Iraq War after the 9/11 attacks and things like that. So in the minds of British politicians, at least, the UK has had this very close relationship with the US. However, now that the US is acting how it's acting and China has clearly become a more, don't know how to put it, desirable, I suppose, partner in terms of business, in terms of trade, in terms of just behaving like a normal trade partner, like how you would expect a normal just economic partner to behave. Having this very no strings attached policy when it comes to doing business, like you don't have to support our politics, we don't have to support your politics, we're just here to strike a deal, essentially. This has become more attractive in the UK because we are broke. And this is a very important thing to understand about the UK economy. So under this 15 years of Conservative government, we have been living under what's called austerity. That basically means reduced spending on all fronts. That means that a lot of basic services have got a lot worse. Think social care, think the NHS, think public transport. All of these things are technically still functioning, but they are just horrible. The state of our public transport system is just a sight to behold. Everything is increasingly expensive. It's cheaper to fly to Spain than it is to get a train from London to Scotland. It's food is becoming increasingly more expensive. You know, the use of food banks and things like that has gone up. This is essentially something that the Labour Party is trying to reverse. Oh, and the housing crisis as well. How could I forget? So the Labour government wants to find a way to invest more in Britain. And we're seeing this in lots of different initiatives. Things like the sort of they're trying to create like a kind of Silicon Valley, I think I can't remember if it's Oxford or Cambridge, but you know, they're trying to help people innovate, they're trying to invest a little bit more, but it's difficult, it's a delicate balance. We don't have any money, we are broke, we are in managed decline. So for me, that's the context in which this article emerges. The UK is broke. We don't have a lot to offer, really, anyone. But if somebody wants to come and invest in us, that's great. So, yeah, let's read the article and find out exactly what the kind of cozying up between the Labour Party and the CCP looks like. The sprawling city of Chongqing in southwest China is an incredible sight. Built on a mountainous terrain and crisscrossed by rivers, it's connected by vast elevated roads. Trains even run through some buildings. TikTokers have begun documenting their commutes in the striking urban architecture, generating millions of likes. But it's also where, on a somewhat quieter trip, mayors and their deputies from the UK recently visited, the largest British civic delegation to go there in history. The whole trip, which took place in March, received substantial Chinese media coverage despite flying more under the radar in the UK. The impression it left on some of the politicians who travelled there was vast. The city is what happens if you take the planning department and just say yes to everything. It's just amazing, said the Deputy London Mayor for Business. The group travelled to southern Chinese cities, spoke to Chinese mayors and met Chinese tech giants. So impressed was one deputy mayor that on returning home, they bought a mobile phone from Chinese brand Honor, a stark contrast from the days the UK banned Huawei technology from its 5G networks. Roughly half a dozen deals were signed on the back of the trip. The West Midlands, for example, agreed to establish a new UK headquarters in Birmingham for Chinese energy company EcoFlow. But the visit was as much about diplomacy as it was trade, East Midlands Deputy Mayor Nadine Peatfield said. There was a real hunger and appetite to rekindle those relationships. I think it's worth pausing here and just pointing out that I haven't been to Chongqing, but I have been to other cities in the southwest, like Chengdu. They are way more advanced in terms of especially transport infrastructure than the UK, and I stayed in Hangzhou for a month or so, and in terms of like technological integration, things like payments, just like how to get around the city and things like that, way better than the UK. Like the UK really is stuck in, I don't know, maybe 2012 if I'm being generous. So I'm not surprised that a lot of these people, especially from the Midlands, which I don't want to say that it's poor, but outside of southeast England, there is not a lot of active investment in other major hubs in the UK. You get some places like Birmingham and Liverpool that do get some recognition, that do get some investment. But in general, because there isn't a devolution of power, lots of money is just concentrated in the London area and surrounding areas, and other places are just left to kind of deal with the shitty infrastructure that they've had for decades. The course correction seemed to begin with the closed-door meeting between Keir Starmer being the Prime Minister of the UK, and Chinese President Xi in Brazil last November. The Prime Minister signalled that Britain would look to cooperate with China on climate change and business. Since then, Labour's cautious pursuit of China has primarily focused on the potential financial upsides. In January, Chancellor Rachel Reeves co-chaired the first UK-China Economic Summit since 2019. She said, choosing not to engage with China is no choice at all. This also kind of goes back to the episode that we did on there is no decoupling from China, right? About how the president of the EU at the time, von der Leyen, I think her name is, Ursula von der Leyen, made that speech being like, we know that the US wants us to decouple from China, but we can't. Like, we can't afford to. There's no way that that's possible because we import everything from China. We're a major market for Chinese companies, particularly growing sectors like electric vehicles. And we need Chinese business support. We need them to be open to us as well, to our service industries, to our higher education. So all of these things are interlinked. And I think that European nations, including the UK, have a very different perspective than the US, and we're starting to see that rift appear in real time. Reeves claimed re-engagement with China could boost the UK economy by £1 billion, with agreements worth $600 million to the UK over the next 5 years, partially achieved through lifting barriers that restrict exports to China. Soon after, Energy Secretary Ed Miliband resumed formal climate talks with China. Miliband said it would be negligence to future generations not to have a dialogue with the country, given it is the world's biggest carbon emitter. Labour simply describes its approach as grown up, but it appears to be a marked shift from the last decade of UK-China relations. Labour claimed in its manifesto that it would bring a long-term and strategic approach. China has a near monopoly on extracting and refining rare earth minerals, which are critical to manufacturing many high-tech and green products. For example, car batteries are often reliant on lithium, while indium is a rare metal used for touchscreens. This makes China a vital link in global supply chains. China's influence is likely to continue to grow substantially globally, especially with the US starting to turn inwards, says William Matthews, a China specialist at Chatham House think tank. The world will become more Chinese, and whilst that's difficult for any Western government, there needs to be sensible engagement from the get-go. The opportunities, some experts say, are largely economic, climate and education related. Or as Kerry Brown, Professor of Chinese Studies at King's College London puts it, China is producing information, analysis and ways of doing things that we can learn from. He points to the intellectual, technological, AI and life sciences opportunities. Not engaging with China would be to ignore the realities of geopolitics in the 21st century, given that it's the world's second largest economy. However, Matthews also believes that engagement comes with certain risks. Charles Parton, who spent 22 years of his diplomatic career working in or on China, raises questions about the UK's economic and national security. For example, the government is reportedly weighing up proposals from Chinese companies to supply wind turbines for an offshore wind farm in the North Sea. Mr. Parton warns against allowing China access to the national grid. It wouldn't be difficult in a time of high tension to say, by the way, we can turn off all your wind farms. But earlier this year, the China Chamber of Commerce to the EU issued a statement expressing concern over the politicisation of deals between wind developers in Europe and Chinese turbine suppliers. Yeah, that last statement seems a bit paranoid to me. Not that there isn't a place for paranoia in these sorts of discussions. I think that obviously national security is something that needs to be safeguarded. That goes without saying. Claiming that turbine manufacturers are going to give the CCP access to the UK national grid and sort of turn off the power of the UK goes against, I don't know, Chinese interests in some way, I think is a bit far-fetched. I don't know to what extent they have like remote control access over these things. I don't know anything about wind turbines. Maybe they can turn them off at will. It seems a bit of a stretch. I understand generally the conversation around national security though, and not giving away too much ownership of your country to a foreign power. Obviously that's very sensible to be cautious of that sort of thing. And in our brokenness in the UK, it would be very easy for us to sort of rush into deals that look good and shiny on the surface, but may have long-term consequences that we haven't really thought about yet. You don't want to end up selling, entire train lines, for example, to Chinese-run companies. A lot of the rail lines in the UK, I think all of them, the majority of train lines in the UK are privatised, and they want to renationalise them. But if China were to, say, start supplying high-speed rail connections and like helping us with that sort of technology, would they then demand a part ownership, part profit from that? There are things like that to consider. I think it's more what kind of long-term deals are we tying ourselves into rather than a national security threat per se. But, we haven't seen that advancement in technology yet. Maybe they will be able to remote control all our trains and our mobile phones in the future. Who knows? But I thought that was just an interesting topic to discuss as a British person, because this is something that's going to potentially affect me and my family and the people that I know directly. So I personally think that this would be a good thing just because we are so broke and we do need that investment. And I agree that it's silly to ignore, how the tables are turning between China and the US and the new power dynamics in the 21st century. I think it'd be silly for us to not realign ourselves appropriately, especially when we don't have any cards on the table. We don't have a dog in this fight. Really, like, what power really does Britain have anymore in its post-imperial world? It doesn't really matter what side we pick in terms of doing business. There's nothing to stop us doing business from both US and Chinese businesses. Like, there's again, as they're saying in this article, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And I think the paranoia will eventually drop away as China is seen as a more reliable business partner. But again, this is something that's going to take decades to come to fruition. So if you're watching on YouTube, that is the end of the video for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like access to the full video, you can go over to Buy Me a Coffee right now and either become a supporter or a member for just £5. And yeah, but if you want to keep enjoying content for free, no worries. I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.